Daniel had always loved the idea of escaping the noise and chaos of the city. After years of service in the military, he wanted a place where he could breathe, think, and be at peace. 10 years ago, he found a small abandoned cabin tucked deep in a forest. It was simple, worn down, and surrounded by thick trees and wildlife, but it felt perfect. The cabin was exactly what he needed: a quiet retreat from the world, a place to recover, and a place to feel in control of his own space. He bought it on a whim, imagining evenings by the fireplace and mornings listening to birds sing. Life had other plans, though. Daniel's parents grew old, and his sister needed help with her children. Work commitments and a few health issues made it impossible for him to spend much time at the cabin. Slowly, the little retreat he had dreamed about became an empty building left behind, tucked away among the trees. He visited only occasionally, making quick trips to check on it and make small repairs. Over the years, the cabin began to feel like a distant memory. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel decided it was finally time to return for a longer stay. He packed his gear, making sure he had everything he would need for a few weeks. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through small towns and past rivers that glimmered under the sunlight. As he drove, he remembered all the times he had dreamed of sitting by the fire, reading, writing, and just being alone in the quiet. He felt excitement and anticipation building up in his chest. This was finally his chance to reconnect with the place he had loved. When he turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, something felt off immediately. The path looked well used, unlike the rough, neglected trail he remembered. He frowned, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The last time he had been there, the grass was tall and the trees grew wild around the cabin. Now the grass looked neatly mowed, and there were clear signs that someone had been living there. As he got closer, his heart sank. There was a small garden with flowers blooming in orderly rows and a car parked near the porch. Daniel slowed down, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He stepped out of his truck, taking in every detail. The cabin's paint looked fresh. The windows were clean and smoke was rising from the chimney. It looked as if someone had been living there comfortably, enjoying the cabin as their own. Daniel's mind raced. How could this happen? He had owned the cabin for 10 years. No one had permission to live there. Yet everything suggested that someone had made it their home. Daniel approached cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of the occupant. He saw a mailbox with a name he did not recognize. The name looked official, not just a random tag. He took a deep breath and walked up to the porch, every nerve in his body alert. He rang the doorbell, a mixture of hope and fear in his chest. After a moment, the door opened and a woman in her 40s appeared. She was holding a clipboard and looked at him with a calm, professional expression. "Hello," she said. "Can I help you?" Daniel introduced himself and explained that he owned the cabin. He had returned after 10 years and had been shocked to find someone living there. The woman nodded politely and introduced herself as a member of the local homeowners association. She explained that the property had been considered abandoned and that the HOA had taken steps to maintain it. She said they were there to ensure the cabin was safe and looked after, implying that they had the right to occupy it temporarily. Daniel felt a wave of anger and confusion. How could the HOA just take over his property?
He had all the legal documents proving ownership.
He tried to remain calm, asking questions and trying to understand their reasoning. The woman remained composed, repeating that they were only following procedure and that the cabin had been empty for years. He asked to see the paperwork, but the woman said it was in the office and that they were only the on-site caretakers. Daniel's mind raced. He had to find a way to regain control, but he also knew that acting aggressively could make things worse. He took photos of the property, making sure every detail was documented. He called a local lawyer to discuss his rights and what steps he could take. The lawyer advised patience and careful documentation, warning that any rash actions could be used against him. Over the next few hours, Daniel explored the area around the cabin. He noticed small signs that the HOA had been living there comfortably: a stack of firewood neatly arranged, a small vegetable garden, and even a bird feeder filled with fresh seeds. Every detail made him realize that this wasn't just casual maintenance. They had made themselves at home. Yet Daniel refused to give up. This cabin belonged to him, and he was determined to reclaim it. He went back to the porch and spoke with the woman again, explaining that he had returned and that the property was legally his. She listened, taking notes, and promised to relay the information to the HOA board. Daniel left for the day, frustrated but not defeated. He drove back down the dirt road, thinking through every possible step he could take. He reviewed his legal documents, photographs, and even his own memories of the cabin. He knew that reclaiming it would not be simple, but he felt a determination he hadn't felt in years. That evening, sitting in his truck and watching the sun set behind the trees, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him back here. The cabin was more than just a structure. It represented freedom, peace, and a connection to the life he had always wanted after the military. Losing it, even temporarily, felt personal. But he also knew that patience and strategy would be his greatest allies. Over the next few days, Daniel began gathering evidence, taking photos, and writing down detailed notes about the cabin and the HOA's presence. He made phone calls to local authorities and his lawyer, preparing for a legal confrontation if necessary. He also spoke with neighbors discreetly, gathering information about the HOA's activities and learning that other abandoned properties in the area had been taken over similarly. Each piece of information fueled his determination to reclaim his cabin. As Daniel prepared for what lay ahead, he felt a strange mix of emotions. There was frustration and anger, yes, but also a sense of challenge. This was not just about property. It was about standing up for his rights, proving that careful planning and determination could overcome bureaucracy. He reminded himself of the discipline he had learned in the military, calm, methodical, and patient. This situation would require every ounce of that discipline. Daniel spent the night in his truck near the cabin, listening to the sounds of the forest, thinking about the steps he would take. He knew that the next few days would test him, but he also felt a quiet excitement. The cabin had called him back, and he was ready to face whatever obstacles lay in his path. The forest was peaceful, the air crisp, and the stars shone brightly overhead. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a deep connection to this place. It wasn't just about reclaiming a cabin. It was about reclaiming a piece of his life. By morning, he had a plan. He would approach the HOA again, calmly but firmly, armed with documentation and evidence of ownership. He would make it clear that he was not leaving, and he would follow every legal step necessary to ensure the cabin returned to him. The process might take time, but Daniel was no stranger to challenges. He had faced far greater obstacles in the military, and this was just another mission, another problem to solve. As he packed up his truck and prepared to spend the day at the cabin, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cabin, abandoned for 10 years, had not forgotten him, and he would not forget it. Every step he took from here on would be careful, deliberate, and determined. This was just the beginning of a journey that would test his patience, courage, and resolve, but he was ready. The cabin had waited for him, and now he would reclaim it. Daniel spent the night in his truck, parked a short distance from the cabin, the quiet of the forest settling around him. The moonlight reflected on the trees and the sounds of owls and distant wildlife made him feel both peaceful and alert. Sleep came in fits with dreams of the cabin and the unexpected challenge he now faced. In his dreams, the cabin seemed alive, as if it was reminding him that it had been waiting for him all these years. When he woke up at dawn, he felt a sense of purpose. Today, he would approach the HOA again, determined to make his presence clear and assert his rights calmly but firmly. Daniel approached the cabin slowly, keeping his hands visible and his demeanor calm. The woman from the HOA was already outside, tending to the small garden near the porch. She looked up as he neared, and her expression was polite but neutral. Daniel introduced himself again and explained that he had returned to reclaim his property. He handed her copies of his ownership documents, showing proof that the cabin legally belonged to him. She accepted the papers and said she would pass them to the HOA board, but she made no promise to leave immediately. Daniel felt a mix of frustration and patience. He understood the HOA's position. They claimed they were following procedure and that the cabin had been abandoned. But he also knew the law was on his side, and he was not going to give up without following every necessary step. He asked questions about how long they had been living there and whether any agreements had been signed, and she answered cautiously, giving him only vague information. He realized that reclaiming the cabin would not be quick or simple, and that he needed a strategy. Over the next few days, Daniel explored the property more carefully. The cabin had changed in subtle ways. new window locks, a repaired porch, and some small renovations. These changes made him realize that the HOA had been living there comfortably for some time. Still, he focused on the bigger picture, his rights and the legal path he needed to take. Each observation he made, each detail he noted, added to the growing plan he was forming in his mind. He began documenting everything meticulously, taking photos, videos, and notes on each aspect of the cabin and the surrounding area. Daniel also reached out to neighbors discreetly, trying to learn more about the HOA's presence and their practices. Some neighbors were sympathetic, sharing stories of other abandoned properties that had been occupied temporarily by the HOA. Others were cautious, warning him not to make any rash moves. He listened to all of it, carefully weighing every piece of information. His military training had taught him to observe, plan, and act with precision, and he applied the same discipline here. Every action had to be deliberate, every move calculated. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed in his truck or nearby camping area, eating simple meals and keeping watch. He noticed small routines in the HOA members, morning walks, tending to the garden, and occasional maintenance on the cabin. He realized that patience would be crucial. Acting too quickly or aggressively could backfire, making the HOA less willing to cooperate. Instead, he decided to remain calm, showing that he was serious about reclaiming the cabin but not threatening. His approach would be firm but non-confrontational, using the law and careful documentation as his leverage. One morning, the woman from the HOA approached him with a slight change in tone. She had reviewed some of the documents he had provided and seemed more aware that he was serious. Daniel spoke calmly, explaining that he understood their role in maintaining abandoned properties but that this cabin was never truly abandoned. It had always been his, and he had returned. He made it clear that he expected the cabin to be vacated as soon as possible, but he remained respectful and professional, avoiding anger or threats. This careful approach seemed to have an effect. The woman nodded and promised to pass his request to the HOA board immediately. Daniel spent the afternoons walking around the surrounding forest, taking note of boundaries and familiar landmarks. He wanted to fully understand the property he was reclaiming, and he found that being on the land helped him stay grounded and focused. The forest reminded him why he had fallen in love with this cabin in the first place: the peace, the quiet, and the connection to nature. Even though the situation with the HOA was stressful, he drew strength from the environment, allowing him to plan carefully rather than react impulsively. As the days passed, Daniel continued to make phone calls to his lawyer, reviewing every possible legal step he could take. His attorney advised patience, documentation, and formal notices. Daniel drafted letters explaining his ownership, attaching evidence, and clearly requesting that the HOA vacate the property. He mailed them through certified mail, ensuring that there would be official records of his requests. Each step he took was deliberate, calculated, and grounded in facts, not emotion. The HOA's responses were slow and cautious. They acknowledged receiving his letters but gave vague timelines for action. Daniel realized that bureaucracy was part of the challenge and that patience would be his ally. Each day he returned to the cabin, observing, documenting, and making notes. He spoke with neighbors occasionally, gathering insight and reassurance. People admired his calm, methodical approach, often expressing surprise at how composed he remained, despite the frustrating circumstances. One evening, Daniel sat on a rock near the cabin, watching the sunset paint the trees with shades of gold and orange. He reflected on the situation, understanding that this experience was more than a battle over property. It was a test of character, patience, and discipline. He realized that frustration could not control him. Instead, he needed focus, planning, and perseverance. The forest, the cabin, and even the challenges with the HOA became part of a larger journey of resilience and determination. By the end of the week, Daniel felt that the situation was slowly shifting in his favor. The HOA began asking questions and clarifying details, indicating that they were taking his claims seriously. Daniel maintained his calm approach, carefully documenting every interaction and response. He knew that the next steps would require formal meetings and possibly legal action, but he was ready. The experience had strengthened his resolve, teaching him that persistence, patience, and respect for the process were as important as assertiveness. Daniel's nights were spent by the fire, reviewing his notes, planning the next day, and reflecting on the cabin's significance. The peace of the forest, the rhythm of nature, and the memories of years past gave him strength and perspective. He understood that reclaiming the cabin was not just about possession, it was about honoring the life he had built, the dreams he had carried, and the resilience he had learned through years of challenges. Through careful observation, respectful confrontation, and meticulous documentation, Daniel was slowly laying the groundwork to regain his cabin. Each day he felt more connected to the land, more confident in his approach, and more determined to see the situation through. The cabin was not just a building. It was a symbol of his life, his freedom, and his ability to stand firm in the face of unexpected obstacles. And Daniel knew that he would not leave until he had reclaimed it fully, lawfully, and with the dignity that had guided him throughout his life. Daniel had settled into a routine. Each morning he would wake early, watch the sun rise over the forest, and plan his next steps carefully. The cabin, which had once been his peaceful retreat, now felt like a battlefield of patience and strategy. He knew that reclaiming it would require more than showing ownership papers and polite requests. It required investigation, careful observation, and understanding the people he was dealing with. Over the next several days, Daniel focused on gathering information about the HOA's presence in the cabin. He observed their routines, noting when they were most active and when they left the property. He took detailed notes about everything he saw: tools in the garden, personal items on the porch, and signs that the cabin was not just maintained but lived in comfortably. This evidence, he knew, would strengthen his position when confronting the HOA formally. Daniel also spoke quietly with neighbors, trying to understand the HOA's patterns. Some neighbors admitted that they had noticed activity at the cabin over the years but assumed it was temporary maintenance. Others expressed surprise that Daniel had returned and wondered how the HOA could occupy his property without permission. The information he gathered helped him see a bigger picture. This wasn't just about his cabin, but about a pattern the HOA followed with abandoned properties. Knowing this made him more determined to act carefully and correctly. One afternoon, Daniel approached the cabin with his lawyer on the phone, reviewing the documents that proved his ownership. The woman from the HOA was outside again, tending to the garden. Daniel remained calm, explaining that he was serious about reclaiming the cabin. He showed her all the documentation, including photographs he had taken before and after their arrival, and explained that the cabin was legally his and had never been abandoned. She listened politely, but the look in her eyes suggested resistance. Daniel realized that the HOA was unlikely to vacate without following formal procedures, which meant he needed to be meticulous in documenting every interaction. As the day passed, Daniel spent time walking the property, checking the perimeter, and familiarizing himself with every detail of the land. He noticed small improvements the HOA had made, like repaired shutters and freshly painted railings. Even though these changes were technically positive, they reinforced the idea that the HOA had been living there and treating the cabin as their own. This realization strengthened Daniel's resolve. He knew he had to act methodically, using evidence, documentation, and calm confrontation rather than anger or force. Over the following week, Daniel began drafting formal notices to the HOA, explaining his ownership and requesting that they vacate the property. Each notice was carefully written, including references to legal documents, photographs, and his continuous connection to the cabin over the years. He sent the notices via certified mail and kept detailed records of each communication. This process required patience and discipline, but Daniel understood its importance. A careless mistake could give the HOA an advantage or slow down the process. During this time, Daniel also made calls to local authorities to clarify the legal procedures surrounding abandoned property and HOA occupation. The authorities confirmed that the HOA had certain rights to maintain property considered abandoned, but those rights were not absolute. They emphasized that proper documentation and timely notices from the property owner could challenge any unauthorized occupation. Armed with this knowledge, Daniel felt more confident. He realized that while the HOA might resist, the law was ultimately on his side if he followed it carefully. One evening, as Daniel sat near the cabin reviewing his notes, he noticed the woman from the HOA watching him from the porch. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a small nod, signaling that he was determined and aware. She returned the gesture, And though no words were exchanged, Daniel sensed that his consistent, calm presence was beginning to have an effect. It was subtle, but he understood that patience and persistence were slowly shifting the dynamic in his favor. In the days that followed, Daniel began preparing for a more formal confrontation. He organized all his evidence: photographs of the cabin over the years, copies of ownership documents, records of communication with the HOA, and notes from conversations with neighbors. Each piece of evidence was carefully cataloged, ready to be presented in a meeting with the HOA board or, if necessary, in a legal setting. Daniel felt a mix of anticipation and focus. The process was slow, but he knew that being thorough would ultimately give him the best chance of success. Daniel also began reflecting on the emotional side of the situation. Returning to the cabin after 10 years only to find it occupied was deeply personal. It wasn't just a building, it was a place that represented freedom, peace, and a connection to the life he had always wanted after his military service. The intrusion felt like a violation, but he knew that responding with anger or rash actions would not help. Instead, he focused on controlling his emotions and channeling them into strategy and preparation. As the week went on, Daniel maintained a balance between observation, documentation, and personal reflection. He spent mornings walking the forest, afternoons preparing formal notices, and evenings reviewing his notes by the fading light. He felt a growing sense of determination and clarity. This situation, as frustrating as it was, had become a test of his discipline, patience, and resilience. He understood that reclaiming the cabin would not happen overnight, but he was committed to seeing the process through step by step. One afternoon, Daniel noticed a small change. The woman from the HOA seemed less assertive and more cautious. She approached him while he was taking photographs and spoke politely, asking for clarification about his documents. Daniel calmly explained everything, showing patience and professionalism. He emphasized that his goal was not conflict, but to reclaim his property lawfully. Her demeanor suggested that his careful, respectful approach was beginning to influence her perception. Small victories like this gave Daniel renewed energy and focus. By the end of the week, Daniel had a clear understanding of the situation and his options. He had gathered enough evidence, communicated effectively, and established a consistent professional presence. The HOA was aware that he was serious, and the local authorities had confirmed that his legal rights were strong if he continued to follow the proper procedures. Daniel felt a cautious optimism. The path ahead was still challenging, but he had the tools, knowledge, and patience to see it through. As he sat outside the cabin one evening, watching the sun set behind the trees, Daniel reflected on the lessons he had learned. The cabin had become more than a property dispute. It had become a test of character, resilience, and discipline. He realized that patience, careful observation, and respectful confrontation were powerful tools. The forest around him, the quiet of the cabin, and the memories of the past gave him strength and perspective. He understood that he was reclaiming not just a cabin, but a part of his life, his dreams, and his connection to the world he had chosen to retreat to. Daniel knew that the next steps would require formal meetings with the HOA board and possibly legal intervention. But he felt ready. His preparation was thorough, his evidence solid, and his resolve strong. He had approached the situation methodically, using his experience, discipline, and patience to navigate a challenging and unexpected problem. The cabin was calling him back, and he was determined to answer that call fully, reclaiming it with dignity, lawfulness, and respect for the process. Daniel woke up before dawn, the forest quiet around him. The night had been calm, but he knew today might bring new challenges. Over the past weeks, he had carefully observed the HOA's routines, documented evidence, and begun formal communication through certified letters and phone calls. Today, he planned to take the next step and engage with them more directly, calmly but firmly, to reclaim his cabin. He approached the cabin slowly, keeping a clear view of the surroundings. The woman from the HOA was outside tidying the porch. Daniel greeted her politely, maintaining a calm, professional demeanor. She responded with a nod, her expression neutral but slightly tense. Daniel explained that he had returned to reclaim his property and that all his documentation proved ownership. He reiterated that he wanted to resolve the matter peacefully, but expected the HOA to vacate. The woman took notes and promised to inform the board. but again gave no immediate solution. Understanding that patience was crucial, Daniel spent the day walking around the property, taking detailed notes about every change, every improvement the HOA had made during their occupation. He documented the garden, the repaired shutters, the freshly painted porch, and even the organized firewood. Each piece of evidence reinforced his case that while the cabin had been maintained, it had never truly been abandoned, and their occupation was not authorized. During the afternoon, Daniel called his lawyer to review the next steps. His lawyer advised him to prepare for a formal meeting with the HOA board. They discussed every detail, what to say, how to present evidence, and the importance of staying calm. Daniel listened carefully, knowing that the way he presented himself could make the difference between cooperation and resistance. His military training reminded him that strategy, patience, and attention to detail were his best tools. Later, Daniel reached out to a few neighbors discreetly to gather additional insights about the HOA's practices. He learned that other cabins in the area had faced similar situations, with the HOA stepping in when properties were left unoccupied. Some neighbors shared that the HOA sometimes overstepped, occupying properties for extended periods. This information strengthened Daniel's resolve. He knew he had to be meticulous and persistent, documenting every interaction and preparing for the formal meeting with thorough evidence. As the week progressed, Daniel organized all his documentation into a clear, comprehensive file. Photographs, letters, ownership papers, notes from neighbors, and a timeline of events were all carefully compiled. He wanted to present a strong, factual case to the HOA board, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Each evening, he reviewed the file, rehearsing what he would say and how he would respond to possible objections. Preparation and practice became his focus, building confidence that he could reclaim the cabin through careful, lawful action. One morning, the woman from the HOA approached him while he was reviewing notes near the cabin. She seemed more cautious than usual. Daniel greeted her politely and reiterated his intention to resolve the situation peacefully but firmly. She asked some questions about the documents and timeline, and Daniel explained everything clearly, showing patience and professionalism. He emphasized that his goal was not conflict, but reclaiming his property lawfully. Her demeanor suggested that his careful, calm approach was beginning to influence her perspective. Daniel continued documenting every interaction. He took photographs of the cabin and surroundings daily, noting any changes or signs of occupancy. He also maintained detailed written records of conversations with the HOA members and neighbors. This documentation was not just for legal purposes. It also helped him maintain clarity and focus, reinforcing the careful, methodical approach he had committed to since returning to the cabin. In the evenings, Daniel would sit quietly by the cabin, reflecting on the journey. The forest around him was serene, the sunlight filtering through the trees in soft golden hues. He thought about the challenges he had faced, the patience required, and the importance of persistence. The cabin was more than a building. It was a symbol of his life, freedom, and resilience. Reclaiming it was not just about property. It was about asserting his rights, maintaining dignity, and standing firm in the face of unexpected obstacles. As the HOA board finally scheduled a meeting, Daniel prepared meticulously. He organized his evidence logically, rehearsed his explanations, and anticipated possible questions or objections. He reminded himself to remain calm, focused, and professional. The formal meeting would be the decisive moment, and he knew that the way he presented himself and his evidence would determine the outcome. He felt a mix of nerves and determination, but trusted his preparation and experience. The day of the meeting arrived. Daniel approached the cabin with confidence, carrying his comprehensive file. The HOA board members were present, and the woman who had been acting as the caretaker stood nearby. Daniel greeted everyone respectfully, maintaining a calm and professional demeanor. He presented his case clearly, showing documents, photographs, and records of ownership and communication. He explained the history of the cabin, his absence, and his consistent ownership, highlighting that the property had never been legally abandoned. The board listened carefully, asking questions and reviewing the evidence. Daniel answered each question calmly, providing clear explanations and reinforcing the facts. He emphasized that his goal was to reclaim his cabin lawfully and peacefully, not to create conflict. The meeting lasted several hours, but Daniel remained composed, drawing strength from his preparation, focus, and connection to the cabin. By the end of the meeting, the HOA board acknowledged the validity of his claims. They agreed that the cabin was legally his and that their occupation had no standing. While some procedural steps were required, they committed to vacating the property under official oversight. Daniel felt a sense of relief and quiet triumph. His patience, preparation, and calm approach had paid off. The cabin, which had been a source of stress and uncertainty, was finally being returned to him. In the following days, Daniel oversaw the departure of the HOA members. He documented the process, ensuring that every step was completed properly. Once the property was fully back in his control, he walked through the cabin and surrounding land, taking in the space he had fought to reclaim. Every detail, from the repaired shutters to the small garden, reminded him of the careful planning and persistence that had made this moment possible. Daniel spent the first night back inside the cabin, a sense of peace washing over him. The journey had been challenging, requiring patience, focus, and resilience. He realized that reclaiming the cabin had taught him valuable lessons about standing firm, navigating bureaucracy, and asserting his rights calmly and professionally. The cabin was not just a retreat from the world. It was a testament to his discipline, perseverance, and determination. As he sat by the fireplace watching the flames dance, Daniel reflected on the experience. The forest outside was quiet, the moonlight casting gentle shadows on the trees. He felt a deep connection to the cabin and the land, knowing that he had reclaimed it not through force or anger, but through careful planning, patience, and respect for the process. This victory was more than personal. It was a reminder that persistence, preparation, and composure could overcome even the most unexpected challenges. Daniel knew that the cabin would need attention and restoration, but he was ready. He had reclaimed his space, his peace, and a piece of his life. The journey had tested him, but it had also strengthened him, showing that careful planning, patience, and calm determination were powerful tools. As he settled in for the night, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had not only reclaimed his cabin but also reaffirmed his ability to face challenges with resilience and dignity.